Holzminden Forest, France, September 1944. The sound arrived before the bullets, a mechanical scream that tore through the morning fog like ripping canvas. 1,200 rounds per minute, 20 bullets every second. The men of Charlie Company had learned to recognize the MG-42's signature within their first week in France. Not the methodical chatter of an American 30 cal, but something faster, angrier, a relentless buzzing that devoured air and flesh with equal efficiency. Sergeant William Kowalski pressed his face into the black soil at the forest's edge and waited for the sound to stop. It didn't. The German gunner was disciplined, firing in controlled 7-second bursts that swept the tree line from left to right, then back again. Kowalski counted in his head, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, knowing that somewhere in that 140 round burst, there were tracer rounds painting green lines through the mist, and behind those tracers metal-jacketed death. The gun fell silent. Barrel changed. 8 seconds if the crew was good. 10 if they were tired. Kowalski. Lieutenant Harper's voice came from behind an oak tree 20 yards back. Status. Still pinned, sir. Kowalski didn't lift his head. The German gunner owned everything from the road to the far tree line. A killing field 200 yards wide, perfectly flat, offering no cover except the morning fog that was already burning off under the September sun. The buzzsaw started again. Kowalski heard the impacts, thwack, 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 rounds chewing into the oak where Private Mendez had been standing 3 seconds earlier. Mendez was face down now, hands over his helmet, breathing in short gasps that sounded like sobs. This was day 4. 4 days earlier, Charlie Company had received simple orders. Advance east along the Holzminden Road. Secure the junction at kilometer post 47, link up with the 90th Infantry pushing south. Simple. Except nobody had mentioned the MG-42 nest, dug into the stone farmhouse overlooking the road. A perfect position with interlocking fields of fire, reinforced walls, and a crew that rotated shifts like Swiss clockwork. Day 1. Captain Morrison sent 1st Platoon straight up the road. The MG-42 opened up at 400 yards. 7 men down before they reached cover, 3 dead, 4 wounded. Medic Thompson caught a round through the shoulder. Trying to drag out Corporal Hayes, Hayes bled out in the ditch. Day 2. 2nd Platoon tried flanking through the orchard on the left. The Germans had anticipated it. A secondary gun position caught them in the open. 9 casualties. Lieutenant Grayson took shrapnel to the leg and had to be carried back on a poncho. The company medic, Doc Wilkins, worked through the night. His hands were still shaking the next morning. Day 3. Artillery. Morrison called in a fire mission. 2 dozen 105mm shells that turned the farmhouse into a dust cloud for exactly 8 minutes. When the smoke cleared, the MG-42 started. Firing again. The gunner had moved to a pre-prepared alternate position 30 yards west. 4 more men hit trying to advance during the barrage. One of them was Private D'Angelo, the kid from Brooklyn who kept a photograph of his baby daughter tucked inside his helmet liner. Kowalski had watched him die, chest torn open, still trying to speak. Now it was day 4, and Charlie Company had 14 names on the casualty list. 14 men who wouldn't see October, and the MG-42 was still firing. Kowalski studied the killing field through a gap in the brush. The road cut straight east through cleared farmland, wheat stubble and plowed earth, nothing taller than the 6 inches. The German gunner had visibility for 1,000 yards. Behind the gun position, the farmhouse ruins provided perfect cover. The gun itself was invisible from Kowalski's angle, but he could see the muzzle flash. A bright strobe that appeared, disappeared, appeared again with metronomic precision. He'd been watching for 3 hours now, since before dawn, watching and counting. The pattern was consistent, 7-second bursts, 8-second pauses for barrel changes, 1 minute of silence every 15 minutes while the crew rotated or brought up fresh ammunition belts. The gunner was good, disciplined. He didn't waste ammunition on empty ground, but the moment anything moved in the tree line, the buzzsaw roared to life. Sarge, Private First Class Luca, crawled up beside Kowalski, keeping low. Morrison wants you at the CP. Kowalski nodded and began the slow crawl backwards, staying below the sight line. Behind him, the forest offered safety, tall oaks and thick undergrowth that the MG-42 couldn't penetrate. But safety didn't capture objectives. Safety didn't take the road junction. Safety didn't bring the boys home. Captain Morrison's command post was a shell crater 50 yards back, covered with a camouflage net and ringed with sandbags scrounged from an abandoned French position. Morrison sat on an ammunition crate, studying a map with Lieutenant Harper. Both men looked like they hadn't slept in days. Morrison's eyes were red-rimmed, his uniform stained with dried mud and someone else's blood. Kowalski, Morrison didn't look up. Tell me something I don't know. Same gun, same position, same crew rotation, Kowalski said. Firing every time we show ourselves. 7-second bursts, excellent discipline. They've got ammunition to spare, and they're not shy about using it. Casualties? None today. Nobody's been stupid enough to try. Harper snorted, because the smart approach worked so well the first 3 days. Morrison finally looked up. His face was gray. Division wants this road by 1800 hours. General's convoy needs to move through tomorrow morning. That means we have... He checked his watch. 9 hours to dislodge 1 German machine gun. That's already killed 14 of my men. Silence. Somewhere in the forest behind them a bird sang. It sounded obscene. We could wait for tanks, Harper offered. Tanks are tied up at Metz. Won't be available for another week. Air support? Weather's turning. Fog forecast for tomorrow. No fighters. More artillery? Morrison shook his head. You saw what happened yesterday. They've got at least 3 alternate positions. Every time we drop shells, they just move and start shooting again. We'd need to level the entire grid square, and Division won't authorize that kind of expenditure for a single gun. Kowalski listened to the familiar litany of obstacles. He'd heard it before. In training in England, on Omaha Beach, in every bocage field and bombed-out village between Normandy and here. The problem was always the same. Doctrine was written for ideal conditions, and ideal conditions never existed. The manual said to call in armor, or air support, or artillery. But what happened when none of those were available? What happened when it was just you, the enemy, and a problem that needed solving? I've got an idea, Kowalski said. Both officers looked at him. Harper's expression was skeptical. Morrison's was desperate. Go ahead, Sergeant. Kowalski chose his words carefully. The gunner's good, but he's got to tell. He fires at movement, any movement. Doesn't matter if it's a man, a helmet on a stick, or a shadow in the trees. If something moves in his field of fire, he opens up with a full burst. Every time. So, Harper said, that's what machine gunners do. So what if we made him waste his ammunition on targets that can't shoot back? Morrison frowned. Explain. Back home in Nebraska, we use scarecrows to keep crows off the corn. Basic setup, straw, old clothes, couple of sticks. But the important part wasn't making them look like people. It was making them move. Birds aren't stupid. Static scarecrow, they ignore it after a week, but if you rig it so the wind makes it shift around, that keeps them nervous. Harper stared at him. Kowalski, are you seriously suggesting? Hear him out, Morrison said quietly. Kowalski pressed forward. We build dummies, 3 or 4 of them. Use old uniforms, straw, helmets, from the casualties. Rig them on ropes so we can make them pop up in different spots along the tree line. The gunner sees movement, he fires. We pull the dummies down, move them, pop them up somewhere else. He fires again. We do this for 20 minutes, half an hour, however long it takes, until he's burned through every ammunition belt he's got. Then, while his crew's running back to their supply dump for more, we move. The silence that followed was different this time. Morrison was thinking. Harper was shaking his head, but he wasn't laughing. That's insane, Harper finally said. The Germans aren't crows. No, Kowalski agreed, but that gunner's been trained to shoot at anything that moves. It's reflex. 7-second burst, barrel change, scan for targets. Repeat. He's been doing it for 4 days straight. You think he's going to stop and carefully verify that the target's real before he fires in combat with adrenaline running? Morrison studied the map, but Kowalski could see he wasn't really looking at it. He was calculating, counting the cost. How many dummies would you need? Morrison asked. 3 minimum. 5 would be better. How long to build them? Give me 4 hours and 3 men. We've got the materials. Uniforms from the casualties, straw from that barn we passed yesterday, rope from the supply depot, Harper cut in. And if it doesn't work, if the gunner sees through it, then we're exactly where we are now, Kowalski said flatly. Pinned down, bleeding men, and no closer to that road junction. But if it does work, if we can make him burn his ammunition on Ghost, we might save 40 lives. Morrison looked at Harper. Your platoon's next in the rotation. Harper's jaw tightened. Sir, this is not a democracy, Lieutenant. Sergeant Kowalski's plan is unorthodox, but so is sending my men into a meat grinder for the 5th straight day. He turned back to Kowalski. You've got your 4 hours. Pick your men. If this works, I'll write you up for a commendation. If it fails, you can bury me with the scarecrows, sir. Morrison didn't smile. Dismissed. Kowalski walked back through the forest, his mind already assembling the pieces. He'd need Private First Class Luca, smart kid, good with his hands, kept calm under pressure, and Corporal Chen, the former engineering student who understood angles and sight lines, and maybe Mendez if the kid had stopped shaking. Behind him, through the trees, the MG-42 fired another burst. Someone had been careless, shown themselves for just a moment. The gun hammered away for 7 seconds, 140 rounds, then fell silent. Kowalski counted the pause. 8 seconds. The crew was still sharp. He thought about Nebraska, about October mornings, walking the corn rows, checking the scarecrows, adjusting their positions. His father had taught him the trick. It wasn't about making them look human. It was about making them move like a threat. The crows didn't need to believe. They just needed to hesitate, to stay uncertain long enough to leave the crop alone. The Germans would hesitate too. Kowalski was betting his life on it. And maybe, if he was right, 40 other men would get to go home and plant their own crops next spring. American forward position, Holtzminden Forest, September 1944. The straw smelled like home, dry wheat chaff mixed with the mineral tang of French soil. Kowalski knelt beside the collapsed barn, pulling handfuls of it from beneath a collapsed rafter, stuffing it into empty sandbags. Behind him, Private First Class Luca and Corporal Chen worked in silence, their faces showing the careful blankness of men following orders they didn't quite believe in. Sarge, Luca finally said, you really think this is going to work? Kowalski didn't look up. I think it's better than walking into that field again. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I've got. They'd been at it for 2 hours now, scavenging materials from the ruins of what had once been a prosperous farm. The barn had taken a direct hit from artillery, probably American, probably during the initial advance in August, and its contents were scattered across 50 yards of debris. But the straw had survived, protected beneath the fallen beams. Kowalski had learned in Nebraska that good straw kept for years if it stayed dry. This batch was perfect, golden, still slightly fragrant, dense enough to hold shape. Corporal Chen emerged from the farmhouse ruins carrying an armload of rope. Found this in what's left of the cellar. Pre-war hemp, good quality. Should hold. How much? Maybe 80 feet total. Enough for your pulley system if we're careful. Kowalski nodded. The rope was critical. The dummies needed to move, not just stand there like static targets, but rise and fall, appear and disappear, create the illusion of soldiers maneuvering under fire. He'd spent the first hour sketching the rigging system in his head, a series of lines running through the trees parallel to the German position with the dummies attached at intervals. Pull one rope, a dummy pops up behind that fallen log. Pull another, a second dummy rises near the oak tree. The German gunner would see movement at multiple points, would have to track and engage each target, and with every burst he'd be burning through ammunition that took time to resupply, time to reload, time that Charlie Company could use to move. What about uniforms? Luca asked. Kowalski's jaw tightened. Graves' registration collected the intact ones yesterday, but there's still some pieces. He gestured toward a pile he'd been assembling. 3 torn jackets, 2 pairs of trousers with bloodstains no one had bothered to wash out, 4 helmets with shrapnel damage, the detritus of 4 days of failed assaults. Luca stared at the pile. That's, Jesus, Sarge, that's D'Angelo's jacket. See the patch his girl sewed on? I know whose it is. Doesn't seem right. Using a dead man's clothes like this. Kowalski stood, brushing straw from his knees. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried an edge that made both younger men look up. You know what's not right? D'Angelo dying for nothing, Hayes bleeding out in a ditch because we kept using the same tactics that didn't work the first time. 14 men dead because nobody wanted to try something that wasn't in the manual. He picked up D'Angelo's jacket, held it up to the light. The patch showed a crude drawing of a baby, Lucia D'Angelo, age 11 months, who would grow up without ever knowing her father. We use this jacket. Maybe it saves another man from wearing a flag. Maybe some other kid gets to keep their father. You tell me which one D'Angelo would have wanted. Silence, and then Chen bent down and picked up a helmet. Let's get to work. By noon, they had 3 crude assemblies laid out on the ground. Torsos made from sandbags stuffed with straw. Limbs fashioned from branches and wrapped in torn uniform pieces. Heads that were nothing more than helmets perched on wooden stakes. They looked absurd in daylight, like scarecrows built by children playing at war. But Kowalski knew the German gunner wouldn't see them in daylight. He'd see them at 200 yards in motion for maybe 3 seconds before pulling the trigger. They need to be heavier, Chen said, hefting one of the torsos. Too light and they'll blow around in the wind. The Germans will know something's wrong. Kowalski nodded. Add more straw and rocks. There's plenty in the foundation rubble. Pack them into the chest cavity. We want these things solid enough that they drop convincingly when we release the ropes. Like they've been shot, Lucas said quietly. Exactly like they've been shot. They worked through the midday heat refining the designs. Kowalski made them build a 4th dummy, then a 5th. More targets meant more confusion, more ammunition wasted. Chen rigged the rope system with the precision of an engineering student, creating a network of pulleys that would allow 2 men to control all 5 dummies from concealed positions in the tree line. Luca focused on the details, making sure helmets sat at natural angles, that uniform pieces overlapped convincingly, that each dummy had distinct characteristics, one taller, one broader, one leaning slightly as if wounded. We're building ghosts, Luca muttered, tying off a rope. Dead men to fool the living. No, Kowalski corrected. We're building bait. The ghosts come later when we don't do this and send real men instead. At 1400 hours, Lieutenant Harper appeared at the barn ruins. He stood for a long moment, staring at the dummies laid out like corpses awaiting burial. His expression was unreadable. Sergeant Kowalski, Captain Morrison sent me to check your progress. Kowalski straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. We're on schedule, sir. Should be ready for deployment by 1600. Harper walked slowly around the dummies, examining each one. He picked up a helmet, turned it over in his hands. The inside was stained dark brown. This is what we've come to? Building scarecrows. This is how we fight the Wehrmacht? It's how we stop dying, sir. You can't possibly believe this will work. Look at these things. They're ridiculous. A blind man could tell they're not real. From here, sure, but that gunner's 200 yards out, watching through a sight aperture, jacked up on adrenaline after 4 days of combat. He sees movement in the tree line. He fires. It's reflex. Training? Harper dropped the helmet. It bounced once and settled in the dirt. You're gambling with men's lives on a farm trick. You understand that? When this fails, and it will fail, Morrison's going to send my platoon into that field anyway. And when they die, it'll be because we wasted 4 hours playing with straw dolls instead of planning a real assault. Kowalski felt heat rising in his chest, but kept his voice level. With respect, sir, what's the real assault? We tried frontal, we tried flanking, we tried artillery. 14 men are dead, and that gun is still firing. You want to make it 20? 30? At what point do we admit the doctrine isn't working? The doctrine, Harper said coldly, is written by people who understand tactics, not by farmers who think they can outsmart the German army with parlor tricks. The doctrine's written by people who aren't getting shot at. Harper's face flushed. You're out of line, Sergeant. Then court-martial me after we take the road junction. For a moment, Kowalski thought Harper might actually strike him. The lieutenant's hand twitched toward his sidearm, and Luca and Chen both froze, watching, but then Harper seemed to deflate slightly, exhaustion replacing anger. You have until 1600, Harper said quietly. After that, we're doing this my way. And God help you if this circus costs us more men. He turned and walked back toward the command post without waiting for a response. Luca exhaled slowly. That went well. Shut up and finish the rigging. They moved the dummies into position just after 1,500 hours, using the afternoon shadows for concealment. The plan was simple. String the rope network through the trees parallel to the German line, position each dummy at a different point along the 300-yard front, then wait for dawn. The test would come in the morning when the fog lifted and visibility improved. The same time Charlie Company had been planning another assault. Kowalski positioned the first dummy behind a fallen log 40 yards from the tree line's edge, close enough that the German gunner would have a clear shot, far enough that it wouldn't seem like an obvious decoy. The rope ran back through a system of pulleys Chen had anchored to 3 different trees, allowing them to raise and lower the dummy from a concealed foxhole 50 yards back. The second dummy went near the oak tree where Mendez had almost died that morning. The third near a cluster of brush on the southern edge. The fourth and fifth were placed at wider intervals, creating the impression of a dispersed skirmish line, exactly the formation an attacking infantry squad would use. Chen tested each rope system while Kowalski watched through binoculars, checking sight lines. From the German position, the dummies would be visible as dark shapes against the lighter background of the forest. Not perfect silhouettes, but enough to trigger that reflex, that training, that instinct to fire at anything that moved. "What do you think?" Chen asked, coiling the excess rope. Kowalski lowered the binoculars. "I think we're about to find out if I'm crazy or smart, maybe both." "You really believe they'll fall for it?" "I believe people see what they expect to see. That gunner's been watching this tree. Line for 4 days. He's seen American soldiers trying to cross that field. Now he's going to see more American soldiers. His brain will fill in the gaps. He won't have time to study each target, calculate whether it's real. He'll just fire. And if he doesn't, then Harper gets his assault and we're all fucked anyway." They returned to the concealed position where Luca was finishing the control station, a sandbagged foxhole with good sight lines to all 5 dummy positions. The ropes converged here, each one marked with colored cloth strips that Chen had torn from a medical flag. Red for dummy 1, white for dummy 2, and so on. Simple, foolproof, impossible to confuse even under fire. Kowalski checked his watch. 15:45 hours. In 15 minutes, Captain Morrison would arrive to inspect the setup. In 17 hours, they'd pull the ropes and see if 14 deaths could teach them something the manual hadn't. Luca was staring at the rope system, his jaw working. "My cousin Paolo," he said suddenly. "He worked construction in Brooklyn before the war. Rigging guy, moving steel beams with pulleys and cables. He used to say the difference between a good rigger and a dead rigger was understanding what happens when things go wrong. You always plan for the failure." "So what's our failure plan?" Chen asked. Kowalski had been thinking about that since morning. "If they don't bite, if the gunner sees through it, we cut the ropes and pull back. No harm done except to my reputation. If they bite but locate our position, we got the standard retreat route marked." He pointed to a series of white stones they'd laid out leading back to the main American line. 60 seconds and we're behind hard cover. And if they bite and it works, then Harper's platoon flanks left while the gun's silent and we pray we're fast enough. Morrison arrived at exactly 1600, Harper trailing behind him with an expression like curdled milk. The captain moved through the dummy positions methodically, checking rope tension, sight lines, the concealment of the control foxhole. He didn't speak until he'd examined everything twice. "Unorthodox," he finally said, "but the engineering's sound. Corporal Chen, this pulley system, it'll hold under tension." "Yes, sir." "Tested each rope at 50 pounds. The dummies weigh maybe 25 each." Morrison nodded slowly. He walked to the tree line's edge, careful to stay concealed, and stared out across the killing field. The MG-42 had been quiet for the last hour. Ammunition resupply, probably, or crew rest, but everyone knew it would start again. It always started again. "Sergeant Kowalski," Morrison said without turning around, "I'm authorizing this operation because I'm out of better options, not because I think it'll work. You understand the distinction?" "Yes, sir." "If this fails, I'm sending Lieutenant Harper's platoon across that field at 6:30 tomorrow. and the casualty estimate is 12 to 15 men. Those deaths will be on both our consciences." Now Morrison did turn, and his eyes were older than his 42 years. "But if we don't try something different, those men die anyway. So we try the scarecrows." Harper made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh or a stifled curse. Morrison ignored him. "You'll execute at first light, 05:45 hours. I want continuous observation of the German position from 05:30. The moment that gun goes silent, the moment you confirm ammunition exhaustion, you signal Harper's platoon. They'll have maybe 2 minutes to cross the field before the Germans resupply. 2 minutes, Sergeant. If your estimate is wrong, if that crew has more ammunition than you think, then Harper's platoon hits the dirt and we're back to square one," Kowalski finished. "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Morrison stepped closer, dropping his voice so only Kowalski could hear. "Because I'm not sure you understand what you're asking these men to bet on. You're asking them to trust that a Nebraska farmer knows more about German machine gun doctrine than the entire U.S. Army intelligence apparatus. That's a hell of a wager." Kowalski met his gaze. "I'm asking them to trust that sometimes the simplest answer is the right one. That gunner's been trained to shoot at movement. We're going to give him movement. Everything after that is just physics and human nature." Morrison held his stare for another moment, then nodded curtly. "Get some rest. It's going to be a long night." As the captain walked away, Harper lingered. He looked at the dummies, at the rope system, at Kowalski. When he spoke, his voice carried no warmth, but no mockery either. "I hope you're right, Sergeant. For all our sakes," he paused, "but I've already written the letters to my men's families, just in case." Then he too was gone, leaving Kowalski alone with Chen and Luca in the gathering dusk. Somewhere across the field, the MG-42 coughed back to life. Just a short burst, maybe 5 seconds. Someone else being careless. The gunner was still sharp, still alert, still waiting. Kowalski sat down in the foxhole and began checking the rope marks again, making sure each colored strip was visible in the fading light. His hands were steady. They'd been steady since that morning in Nebraska when his father had taught him about scarecrows. Not the lesson about keeping birds away, but the deeper one about understanding fear, about knowing that the appearance of danger was sometimes enough. "You think they'll really shoot at these things?" Luca asked quietly. "I think," Kowalski said, that in the dark, we're all shooting at ghosts. We just don't usually admit it." The force settled into evening stillness. In 12 hours, they'd know if ghosts could save the living. American forward position, pre-dawn, September 1944. The fog came in thick at 04:30 hours, dense, wet, smelling of turned earth and decomposition. Kowalski woke from a dreamless sleep to find the forest wrapped in gray, visibility reduced to maybe 30 feet. Perfect conditions. The German gunner couldn't see them working, and, more importantly, when the fog lifted in an hour, the dummies would emerge from the mist like specters. Chen was already awake, testing rope tension in the darkness. "All 5 lines are solid," he whispered. "No slippage overnight." "Good." Kowalski's voice was rough from 3 hours of sleep. "Wake Luca. We need to do a final check before the light comes." They moved through the pre-dawn gloom like ghosts themselves, checking each dummy position, ensuring nothing had shifted in the night. The first dummy, the one behind the fallen log, had settled slightly, its helmet tilting at an unnatural angle. Kowalski adjusted it carefully, aware that the German position was only 200 yards away. In this fog, they were invisible, but sound carried. One careless boot scrape, one cough, and the MG-42 would light up the tree line on general principle. Dummy 2 looked perfect. Dummy 3 had lost some straw from its left arm, probably rats or some other scavenger, but not enough to matter. 4 and 5 were exactly as they'd been positioned yesterday evening. Back at the control foxhole, Kowalski found Luca brewing coffee over a tiny heat tablet, the kind of violation of light discipline that would normally get a man chewed out. But the fog was so thick it didn't matter, and Kowalski's nerves needed the caffeine more than his eyes needed the darkness. "How you feeling, Sarge?" Luca asked, handing him a tin cup. "Like a man about to bet 40 lives on whether Germans shoot at scarecrows." Kowalski sipped the coffee. It was terrible. Bitter, lukewarm, tasting of metal, but it anchored him. "You two ready for this?" Chen nodded. Luka hesitated, then also nodded. Remember the sequence, Kowalski said. Dummy 1 first. We raise it slow, 3 feet per second, no faster. Let the gunner acquire the target. The moment he fires, we drop it and count to 10, then dummy 3, different position. Make him track. Make him think there's movement all along the line. What if he doesn't fire? Luka asked. Then we try dummy 2, and if that doesn't work, we try all 5 at once and hope the volume gets his attention, but he'll fire. I'd bet my stripes on it. Chen checked his watch. 05:30. 30 minutes until we start. Kowalski settled into the foxhole and pulled out his binoculars. The fog was still too thick to see anything, but it was thinning. He could make out the shapes of trees now, the dark mass of the fallen log where Dummy 1 waited. In 20 minutes, visibility would be good enough for the German gunner to engage targets. In 30 minutes, they'd know if Kowalski was a genius or a fool. At 05:30, Lieutenant Harper arrived with his platoon, 23 men down from 32 before this week started. They moved with the careful silence of soldiers who'd been shot at too many times, taking positions in a shallow depression, 40 yards south of Kowalski's foxhole. Harper caught Kowalski's eye and made a sharp hand gesture. Ready? Kowalski nodded back. The pieces were in place. Harper's platoon would wait for the signal, one long whistle blast, then move fast across the killing field while the MG-42's crew was distracted or, ideally, out of ammunition. It was timing, nothing more. Timing and the bet that human reflexes could be exploited. Captain Morrison appeared at 05:40, accompanied by his radio man. He said nothing, just positioned himself where he could observe both the dummy positions and Harper's platoon. His face was carved from stone, the fog lifted like a curtain rising on a stage. One moment, the world was gray nothingness. The next, the killing field emerged, 200 yards of open ground, the ruined farmhouse in the distance, morning light touching the wheat stubble with gold. Beautiful if you ignored the fact that 14 men had died crossing it. Kowalski raised his binoculars and scanned the German position. There, a flicker of movement in one of the farmhouse windows. The gunner was in place, probably scanning the tree line through his optics, looking for American soldiers stupid enough to try again. 05:45, Chen whispered. We're on. Kowalski's hand closed around the red-marked rope. Dummy 1. His palms were sweating despite the cool morning air. This was it. 4 days of death, 4 hours of work, and now one moment to see if a Nebraska farmer's trick could beat German military doctrine. Slow pull, he murmured to Luka, who held the rope's tail end. 3 count. Ready? Ready? 1, 2, 3. They pulled together, smooth and steady. 50 yards away, behind the fallen log, Dummy 1 rose from concealment. To Kowalski's eyes, watching from this angle, it looked absurd. A scarecrow jerking upward on strings, obviously fake, insultingly crude. But he forced himself to imagine it from the German gunner's perspective. A shape emerging from cover, man-sized, wearing an American uniform, moving in that familiar combat crouch. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the MG-42 opened fire. The sound was exactly as Kowalski remembered, that distinctive ripping buzz, impossibly fast. A sustained roar that seemed to tear holes in reality itself. He saw the impacts. Dirt geysering up around the fallen log, tracer rounds painting green lines through the morning air, the dummy jerking violently as rounds hammered through straw and cloth. 7 seconds. 98 rounds. Maybe 100. The gun fell silent. Drop it, Kowalski hissed, and they released the rope. Dummy 1 collapsed behind the log, exactly like a man who'd been shot. Through his binoculars, Kowalski could see straw leaking from the exit wounds, but from 200 yards, it might as well have been blood. Count to 10, Chen said, his voice tight with adrenaline. 1, 2, 3. Kowalski was already reaching for the white-marked rope. Dummy 3, positioned near the brush cluster. The German gunner would be scanning now, looking for more targets, his finger still on the trigger, his training screaming at him to maintain suppressive fire. 8, 9, 10. Pull. Dummy 3 rose from the brush 40 yards north of the first position. Different angle, different location, forcing the gunner to traverse his weapon. The MG-42 responded instantly. Another burst, this one longer, maybe 9 seconds, closer to 120 rounds. The dummy danced under the impacts, straw exploding from its chest, the helmet flying off as a tracer round caught it perfectly. The illusion was complete. From the German position, it must have looked like another American soldier getting cut down. Jesus Christ, Luka whispered. It's working. He's actually... Stay focused, Kowalski snapped. Drop it. Count. They dropped. Dummy 3 counted. Kowalski scanned the farmhouse through his binoculars and saw movement. Definitely 2 men, maybe 3. The gun crew was working, bringing up fresh ammunition belts. They thought they were winning. They thought they were slaughtering Americans. 15 seconds this time, Kowalski said. Let them think we're regrouping, then dummy 2. The seconds crawled past. Kowalski's heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Beside him, Chen and Luka were rigid with tension, their hands white-knuckled on the ropes. Behind them, Harper's platoon waited in absolute silence, watching the insane puppet show unfold. Pull. Dummy 2 rose behind the oak tree, the position where Mendez had almost died yesterday. The gunner's response was immediate and savage. 10 seconds of fire, 140 rounds, tracers streaming through the fog-thinned air like angry hornets. The oak tree took most of the impacts, bark exploding in chunks, but enough rounds found the dummy to shred it thoroughly. 3 dummies, 3 positions, approximately 360 rounds expended. How many rounds per belt? Chen asked, doing the math. 50-round belt drums mostly, Kowalski said, but they've been using 250 belts since yesterday. Saw the ammo cans, so that's 1 full belt plus change. They've got to be feeling it now. Got to be wondering why we're attacking in such small numbers. Or they think we're probing for weak spots, Luka said. Testing their response before the real assault. Kowalski smiled grimly. Even better. Means they'll keep shooting. He pulled the blue-marked rope. Dummy 4, positioned at the southern edge of the tree line. Same result. Immediate fire, sustained burst, dummy destroyed. Then the green rope, dummy 5 at the northern edge. The MG42 was starting to sound different now. The intervals between bursts slightly longer. Barrel change, ammunition reload, crew fatigue. Through the binoculars, Kowalski watched the farmhouse. More movement, more urgent. He could see 2 men working near the window. 1 feeding the belt, 1 on the gun itself. A 3rd man was running back from deeper in the building, probably fetching another ammunition can. They were committed, fully committed, burning through their ammunition stocks on targets that couldn't shoot it back. Cycle back to position 1, Kowalski said. We've got at least 2 more dummies that can still work. Let's see how deep their magazine is. For the next 18 minutes, they ran the dummies through cycles, raising them, letting the German gunner destroy them, collapsing them, moving to the next position. The MG-42 fired again and again. Shorter bursts now, more controlled, but still firing. The gunner was disciplined. Kowalski had to give him that. Even suspecting something might be wrong, training and instinct drove him to engage every target. By Aero 6, Aero 3, they'd cycled through all 5 dummies 3 times. Some of the scarecrows were barely recognizable, just straw and rags hanging from rope. But from 200 yards in the confusion of combat, they still looked enough like casualties to justify the ammunition expenditure. Morrison crawled up beside Kowalski's foxhole. How much longer? Listen, Kowalski said. The MG-42 fired again, but this burst was only 4 seconds, 60 rounds instead of 90. And the pause afterward was longer, 20 seconds instead of 8. They're running low, Kowalski said. That's either a nearly empty belt or they're rationing. Either way, we're close. Close isn't good enough. I need certainty. War doesn't give certainty, sir. Just probabilities. Kowalski pulled dummy 1 up again, or what was left of it. The MG-42 responded with a 3-second burst, 45 rounds. Then silence. Not the normal barrel change silence. Not the ammunition reload silence. A different silence. A desperate silence. Through his binoculars, Kowalski saw frantic movement in the farmhouse. 1 man was waving his arms, shouting, probably the gun commander. Another man was running toward the back of the building, moving fast. The 3rd man, the gunner, was crouched over the MG-42, checking the receiver, the feed mechanism. They were out. That's it, Kowalski said, turning to Morrison. They're dry. Crew's panicking. They're going for resupply. Morrison didn't hesitate. He pulled out his whistle and blew one long, piercing blast. Harper's platoon erupted from the depression like a pack of wolves released. 23 men in a ragged line sprinting across the killing field in the combat crouch, weapons at the ready. They covered the first 50 yards before the German crew even noticed them. By the time someone in the farmhouse started shouting, Harper's men were already 100 yards out. The MG-42 remained silent. Kowalski watched through his binoculars, hardly daring to breathe, and the German gun commander was at the window now, looking down at an empty ammunition belt, then out at the advancing Americans. His face a mask of disbelief. He understood. Too late. He understood. Harper's platoon reached the farmhouse at a dead run. Grenades went through the windows, the distinctive crump of American fragmentation weapons. A single rifle shot, probably a Mauser, then silence. It was over. Chen let out a breath he'd been holding for what felt like hours. Holy shit. Holy actual shit. It worked. Luca was laughing, a high, half-hysterical sound. We killed them with scarecrows. We killed a German machine gun nest with fucking scarecrows. We didn't kill them, Kowalski corrected quietly. We just made them kill themselves. There's a difference. Morrison stood up from the foxhole, brushing dirt from his uniform. His face was unreadable. Casualties? A runner appeared from Harper's position. Lieutenant Harper reports position secured, sir. 3 enemy KIA, no friendly casualties. The gun's intact, just out of ammunition. Ammunition status? They've got maybe 200 rounds left total, sir. Everything else is expended. Harper says they must have fired off 2,000 rounds this morning. 2,000 rounds, 50 belts. All of it aimed at straw men and old uniforms. Morrison looked at Kowalski for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something that might have been respect. Sergeant, that was either the smartest or the luckiest thing I've ever seen in combat. I'm not sure which. Does it matter, sir? I suppose not. Morrison turned to his radio man. Get division on the line. Tell them the road junction's secure. Tell them... He paused. Tell them Charlie Company used innovative suppression tactics to neutralize the enemy position. Should I mention the decoys, sir? No, just say innovative tactics. Let them interpret that however they want. The radio man nodded and moved off. Morrison lingered a moment longer, studying the destroyed dummies scattered across the field. In the growing daylight, they looked pathetic, obvious fakes, crude mockeries of soldiers. You know what the manual would say about this, Morrison said. No mention of scarecrows in FM 7-10. No, sir, but FM 710 doesn't have a chapter on what to do when everything else fails. Maybe it should. Morrison extended his hand. Kowalski shook it. Get some rest, Sergeant. You've earned it. As the captain walked away, Harper's platoon was already moving past the farmhouse, securing the road junction, setting up defensive positions for the convoy that would come tomorrow. The war moved on. It always did. Chen began coiling the ropes, collecting the pieces of the dummies. Luca stood at the tree line, staring out across the field they'd just won without firing a shot. You think anyone will remember this? Luca asked. What we did here? Kowalski thought about that. Thought about reports and official histories, about how battles got written up for the record. He thought about Morrison's careful phrasing, innovative tactics, not scarecrows, not dummies, just tactics. Clean, professional, suitable for a commendation report. No, he said finally. By the time this gets typed up and filed, it'll just be another successful assault, another textbook operation. No mention of farmers or scarecrows or any of the improvising that actually won it. That doesn't bother you? Kowalski looked back at the farmhouse where Harper's men were celebrating, clapping each other on the back, laughing with the relief of men who'd expected to die and hadn't. 23 men who would see tomorrow, maybe 40 across the whole company if the casualty projections had been right. No, Kowalski said, it doesn't bother me at all. Because he knew something the manual didn't teach, something his father had understood about scarecrows and crows. The best victories were the ones where nobody had to die to prove you were right. The best tactics were the ones that made the enemy defeat themselves. And if nobody remembered who built the scarecrows, that was fine. The scarecrows hadn't been built for glory. They'd been built to bring men home. Holzminden Road Junction, France, September 1944. The captured MG-42 sat in the morning sun like a museum piece, its barrel still warm to the touch. Sergeant Kowalski stood in the ruined farmhouse looking down at the weapon that had killed 14 of his brothers and felt nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction, just the hollow exhaustion that came after adrenaline drained away and left only the bill. Private First Class Luca was cataloging the German ammunition expenditure, counting empty belt drums and scattered brass casings. Jesus, Sarge, look at this. The floor was carpeted with spent 7.92mm casings, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, glinting in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the shrapnel-torn roof. Empty ammunition cans were stacked against the wall, 50-round drums, 250-round belts, all of them fired in the past 4 hours. The air still smelled of cordite and hot metal. How many? Kowalski asked. Luca consulted his count. 47 empty belt drums, mostly 50s, but 9 of the big 250s. He did the math on a scrap of paper. 2,350 rounds, give or take. In how long? Based on your timeline, 18 minutes of active engagement. That's about 130 rounds per minute. Well below the gun's cyclic rate, so he was being disciplined. Controlled burst, proper barrel changes. Luca looked up from his notes. This crew knew what they were doing. Kowalski nodded slowly. A good crew, disciplined and trained, following their doctrine perfectly. And that doctrine had killed them, or at least rendered them helpless. They'd fired 2,000 rounds at targets that couldn't shoot back. And when real soldiers came, their gun was silent. Corporal Chen appeared in the doorway. Found the resupply point, basement far corner. They've got maybe 6 more belts down there, 300 rounds total. That's all that's left to up. So we caught them right at the edge, Kowalski said. Another 2 minutes, and they would have had fresh ammunition. Another 2 minutes, and Harper's platoon would have been crossing that field under fire, Chen said quietly. A lot of good men would be dead right now. They stood in silence, contemplating that alternate timeline. Kowalski could see it clearly. Harper's men breaking from cover, the MG-42 opening up with fresh belts, bodies dropping in the wheat stubble. The same story that had played out 13 times already this week, except this time it hadn't. This time, scarecrows had rewritten the script. Lieutenant Harper entered the farmhouse, his uniform dusty but intact. No blood, no holes. He looked at Kowalski with an expression that contained equal parts grudging respect and residual skepticism. Captain Morrison wants to see you at the CP, Harper said. Bring your casualty report. No casualties to report, sir. Harper's jaw tightened. I'm aware, Sergeant. That's why he wants to see you. The command post had moved forward to a stone barn 200 yards past the junction, close enough to the new front line to coordinate operations, far enough back to avoid direct fire. Morrison was there with his staff, studying maps under the barn's collapsed roof, planning the next advance. He looked up when Kowalski approached. Sergeant, walk with me. They moved away from the CP into the orchard that bordered the road. Apple trees, half of them shattered by artillery, the rest still bearing fruit that would never be harvested. The morning was warming up, the fog completely burned off now, revealing a landscape of gentle hills and autumn colors that looked nothing like a battlefield should look. Morrison stopped beneath an intact apple tree and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. He offered one to Kowalski, who took it despite not having smoked in years. They lit up together, the tobacco harsh and comforting. I've been in this army for 23 years, Morrison said, exhaling smoke. I've fought in France, I've trained at Leavenworth, I've read every manual the War Department ever printed. You know what none of them taught me? What's that, sir? How to win without fighting? Morrison gestured back toward the farmhouse. That position should have cost us another dozen men, maybe 2 dozen. The doctrine was clear. Suppress with artillery, assault with infantry, accept casualties as the price of the objective. That's how it's done. That's how it's always been done. But that's not how we did it today. No, today we did it with straw and old uniforms and a farm trick from Nebraska. Morrison took another drag on his cigarette. Division called an hour ago. They want a full report on our innovative suppression tactics. I'm supposed to explain how Charlie Company neutralized a fortified MG-42 position without firing a shot. Kowalski waited. He'd learned that when officers started talking like this, the best strategy was silence. Here's my problem, Morrison continued. If I tell them the truth, that we use scarecrows to make the enemy waste ammunition, I'll sound insane. Divisional staff will think I've cracked under pressure. They'll question my fitness for command. But if I lie, if I write this up as some kind of conventional suppression technique, I'm denying you credit for saving lives. With respect, sir, I don't need credit. I need the tactic to spread. Morrison looked at him sharply. Explain. There are 100 machine gun nests between here and Berlin, maybe 1,000. Every one of them is going to kill Americans unless we find better ways to neutralize them. If this worked once, it can work again. Different variations, different circumstances. But the principles sound. Make them waste ammunition on false targets, then hit them when they're empty. You're suggesting we make this standard doctrine. I'm suggesting we teach it to squad leaders. Let them improvise their own versions. Some outfits might use better dummies. Some might use decoys on trucks or fake movement patterns. But the core idea, exploit the enemy's training against them, that's universal. Morrison crushed out his cigarette against the apple tree. The manual won't allow it. There's no field regulation that covers battlefield deception at the squad level. That's supposed to be handled by divisional intelligence with proper planning and coordination. The manual didn't keep my men alive this morning, sir. Scarecrows did. A long silence. Morrison stared out across the orchard toward the road junction that had cost 14 lives to threaten and 0 lives to take. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weariness of a man caught between two doctrines, the one he'd been taught and the one that actually worked. I'll make you a deal, Sergeant. I'll write this up as coordinated suppression using diversionary tactics. Vague enough that it doesn't sound crazy, specific enough that smart officers might figure out what we actually did. And I'll recommend that company-level commanders be authorized to develop field expedient deception techniques for specific tactical situations. That's not going to change anything, sir. No, it's not, but it's the best I can do within the system. The Army doesn't like cowboys, Kowalski. It likes soldiers who follow orders and execute according to doctrine. You give them too much credit for improvisation, and next thing you know, every sergeant thinks he's Patton. Or maybe every sergeant figures out how to save his squad. Morrison's expression hardened. Don't push this. I'm already going out on a limb recommending anything that smells like unofficial tactics. You want a medal? Fine, I'll write you up for a Bronze Star. You want recognition? I'll make sure your name goes in the unit history. But I cannot endorse a system where every NCO decides tactical doctrine for himself. That way lies chaos. Kowalski nodded slowly. He understood. Morrison wasn't the enemy here. The enemy was a bureaucracy that valued conformity over innovation, that preferred clean casualties to messy successes. The captain was already taking a risk by mentioning the tactic at all. Understood, sir. Write it however you need to. Good. Morrison pulled out another cigarette, thought better of it, put it away. For what it's worth, Sergeant, what you did today was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, and it makes me wonder how many other smart solutions we're missing because they don't fit the manual. Probably a lot, sir. Probably. Morrison started walking back toward the CP, then paused. One more thing. Harper's platoon, every man in it, they know what you did. They know those scarecrows saved their lives. That kind of reputation spreads. Other units are going to hear about it. They're going to want to try variations. I can't stop that, and I won't try. So whatever happens with the official report, the real story's going to propagate through the ranks. Is that a problem? It's reality. And reality doesn't care about regulations. Morrison smiled grimly. Just don't be surprised if you start getting questions from other sergeants about rope tension and dummy construction. The Army runs on doctrine, but it survives on improvisation. By 1400 hours, the story had already spread to Baker Company, positioned 2 miles south. Their commander, Captain Webb, sent a runner asking for details. By 1600, Able Company's first sergeant was at the captured farmhouse examining the scattered dummy remains and taking notes. By nightfall, Kowalski had briefed 3 different squad leaders on the basic technique. The variation started almost immediately. Baker Company's 2nd Platoon built dummies using camouflage netting and tree branches, creating silhouettes that could be raised and lowered without rope systems. Simpler, faster to deploy, less sophisticated, but still effective. Able Company went the opposite direction, constructing elaborate decoys with articulated limbs that could move more realistically. Dog Company, hearing the story third hand, tried using old helmets on sticks. Crude, but surprisingly effective at drawing fire from jittery German sentries. Within a week, every company in the regiment had some version of the dummy tactic in their toolkit. Within 2 weeks, after-action reports from other units started mentioning diversionary targets and ammunition exhaustion tactics. Nobody called them scarecrows. That would have been too informal, too far from doctrine. But the principle was spreading like wildfire through an army that had bled too much against fortified positions. The official record told a different story. Kowalski's Bronze Star citation, when it came through 3 weeks later, mentioned exemplary leadership and tactical innovation in the face of determined enemy resistance. No mention of straw or dummies or farm tricks. The Divisional Intelligence Summary for September 1944 included a brief paragraph on field expedient deception techniques that had shown promise in reducing casualties during assaults on fortified positions. 12 bureaucratic words to describe a method that was saving dozens of lives every week. Lieutenant Harper, in a rare moment of candor over a shared can of rations, admitted what they both knew. The manual will never include this, 20 years from now, some staff college professor will teach the Battle of Holtz-Minden as a standard combined arms operation. Artillery, infantry, textbook assault. Your scarecrows will be a footnote if they're mentioned at all. Kowalski shrugged. Fine by me. I didn't do it for the textbooks. Why did you do it? Because 14 men were dead and I didn't want to make it 40. He scraped the last of the canned hash from the tin. That's the only reason that matters. Holtz-Minden Road Junction 3 weeks later, October 1944. The junction had become a logistics hub, trucks rumbling through day and night, carrying supplies east toward the advancing front. The farmhouse where the MG-42 nest had been was now a checkpoint, manned by military police who didn't know and didn't care about what had happened there in September. Kowalski stood at the tree line one last time before Charlie Company moved out to the next objective. The field looked different now. Engineers had graded the road, filled in the shell craters, cleared away the debris. You couldn't tell that men had died here. You couldn't see the scars. But Kowalski could still see the dummy positions, the fallen log, the oak tree, the brush cluster. He could still see the ropes running through the pulleys, the scarecrows rising and falling, the MG-42 spitting fire at Ghost. He could still hear that distinctive buzz, saw, rattle, that sound that had meant death for 14 men and meant nothing for bundles of straw. Thinking about the scarecrows? Chen appeared beside him, rifle slung over his shoulder. Thinking about the math, Kowalski said. 2,000 rounds fired, 0 casualties on our side. 3 enemy killed, 1 gun captured. By any metric, that's the most efficient engagement Charlie Company fought all month. And nobody will ever know the real story. Some people will, the men who were there. The squad leaders who copied the technique. That's enough. Chen was quiet for a moment. You know what I learned from all this? The doctrine's not wrong exactly. It just assumes you got unlimited resources. Artillery, air support, armor. But down here at squad level, you got nothing but your brain and whatever you can scrounge. That's where the real innovation happens. That's where it has to happen, Kowalski corrected. Because by the time doctrine filters down from division, half your squad's already dead. They walked back toward the assembly area where Charlie Company was forming up for the march east. Luca was there, checking ammunition counts and canteen status. Harper was briefing his platoon leaders. Morrison was arguing with a logistics officer about fuel allocations. The machine of war ground on, indifferent to individuals, focused only on objectives and timetables. But Kowalski knew something that the machine didn't. Every objective was taken by individuals. Every timetable was met by men who improvised when doctrine failed. The scarecrows at Holtz-Minden weren't an exception to the rules. They were proof that the real rules, the ones that actually mattered in combat, were written in the dirt by soldiers who refused to die according to somebody else's script. "Hey, Sarge," Luca jogged over, grinning. "Just heard from a guy in 3rd Battalion. They tried the dummy trick yesterday against a Panzer Grenadier position. Worked like a charm. Krauts burned through 4 machine gun belts, shooting at burlap sacks stuffed with grass." "Anybody hurt?" "Not a scratch. They flanked the position while the Germans were reloading." Kowalski nodded. "That was 16, maybe 20 men who'd go home because a farm trick from Nebraska had spread through the ranks faster than any official directive could move. 20 men who'd never know that their lives had been saved by scarecrows, by the simple understanding that enemies were human and humans could be fooled. "Mount up," Morrison's voice cut through the morning, "and we're moving out." Charlie Company formed into march order and started east toward the next objective, the next fight, the next problem that doctrine wouldn't solve. Kowalski took his place in the column, rifle across his shoulders, boots finding rhythm on the cobblestone road. Behind them, the Holtzminden Junction faded into the distance. The farmhouse, the field, the tree line where scarecrows had danced on ropes and fooled an enemy into exhaustion. It was already becoming memory, already fading into the war's vast catalog of small moments that nobody would remember, but 40 men were still alive. That was the only measurement that mattered. 40 men who would see November, December, maybe even make it home to January. 40 men who existed because someone had remembered that the simplest solutions were often the right ones, and that sometimes winning meant making the enemy defeat themselves. The scarecrows had done their job. And if nobody remembered them, well, that's what scarecrows were for. They stood in fields, silent and forgotten, while the harvest they protected went on living. 3rd Army Sector, Eastern France, November 1944. The intelligence briefing room smelled of stale coffee and mimeograph ink. Major Patterson stood at the front, pointer in hand, addressing a collection of company commanders and senior NCOs pulled from units across the 3rd Army's 32nd Corps. Kowalski sat in the back row, uncomfortable in his cleanest uniform, wondering why he'd been summoned 200 miles behind the front lines for what looked like a standard tactical review. "Gentlemen," Patterson began, tapping a map of the Holtzminden sector, "we're here to discuss what division is calling Coordinated Ammunition Exhaustion Protocols." He paused as if the phrase tasted bad in his mouth. "Some of you may have heard the unofficial version of this story. Today, you'll hear the official one." Kowalski kept his expression neutral. Here it came. The bureaucratic sanitization, the transformation of scarecrows in desperation into something that looked like doctrine. Patterson clicked through a series of typed notes on the easel. In late September, elements of the 90th Infantry Division encountered a fortified MG-42 position that had inflicted significant casualties over a 4-day period. Standard suppression methods, artillery, flanking maneuvers, direct assault, had proven ineffective. Captain Morrison of Charlie Company authorized what the after-action report terms diversionary target deployment to induce enemy ammunition expenditure. A captain in the 3rd row raised his hand. "Sir, is that a fancy way of saying they used decoys?" "The terminology is precise, Captain," Patterson said stiffly. "The technique involved the systematic presentation of false targets to enemy gunners, exploiting their trained response patterns to deplete ammunition stocks prior to assault. The operation resulted in 0 friendly casualties and successful objective capture." "So, decoys." Patterson's jaw tightened. "The point, gentlemen, is that this technique has shown measurable success across multiple engagements. Since the Holtzminden action, we've documented 47 separate instances where units employed similar tactics. Casualty reduction in assaults on fortified positions has averaged 62%. That's a significant tactical advantage." He switched to another chart. This one showing statistics, casualty comparisons, ammunition expenditure ratios. Kowalski recognized the data. It came from Charlie Company's engagement and the dozen copycat operations that had followed. But the numbers were divorced from context, sanitized of all the human details. Nothing about straw or rope systems or the smell of D'Angelo's blood on old uniforms. Just clean mathematics. Division wants this formalized, Patterson continued, not as official doctrine. That would require War Department approval, but as a recommended field technique. We're calling it tactical ammunition exhaustion through target deception. TATD for short. Someone in the front row snorted. That acronym is terrible, sir. The acronym is what it is. What matters is implementation. Patterson gestured to a staff sergeant near the door, who began distributing packets of typed instructions. These are preliminary guidelines based on field reports, construction methods for diversionary targets, deployment protocols, recommended crew sizes. Study them. Adapt them to your unit's specific circumstances. Questions? A grizzled first sergeant spoke up. Sir, these guidelines mention man-sized silhouettes and articulated movement systems. That's a lot of fancy language for scarecrows on ropes. The terminology, Patterson said coldly, is appropriate for official documentation. How you describe it to your men is your business. But in reports and after-action summaries, you will use the approved language. Are we clear? Crystal, sir. Patterson's gaze swept the room and landed on Kowalski. Sergeant Kowalski, you're the originator of this technique. Do you have anything to add to these guidelines? Kowalski stood slowly, aware that every eye in the room was now on him. Just one thing, sir. The guidelines make it sound complicated. It's not. You need something that looks like a soldier from a distance, something you can move, and enough rope to make it work. Everything else is just engineering and common sense. The guidelines provide standardization, Patterson said. We can't have every squad building decoys differently. There needs to be consistency. With respect, sir, consistency is what got 14 of my men killed before we tried something different. The whole point of this is that it's adaptable. Every position's different. Every enemy crew reacts differently. If you standardize it too much, you lose the advantage. The room went quiet. Patterson's expression suggested he wasn't accustomed to being contradicted by sergeants, even in the context of tactical discussions. Your point is noted, Patterson said carefully. However, the Army operates on standardization for good reason. We need reproducible results, not individual interpretations. He turned back to the broader group. The guidelines are recommendations, not requirements. Use judgment. Adapt as needed, but document everything. Division wants data. The briefing continued for another 40 minutes. Detailed breakdowns of successful engagements, failure analysis of attempts that hadn't worked, recommendations for future implementation. Kowalski half listened, his mind drifting back to that September morning in the fog, watching Dummy 1 rise behind the fallen log, waiting to see if he was brilliant or insane. When Patterson finally dismissed them, Kowalski was halfway to the door when a voice called out, "Sergeant Kowalski." A word. It was Lieutenant Colonel Kowalski he didn't recognize. Tall, thin, with staff officer written all over him. They stepped into the hallway. "Colonel Hendricks, tween. Corps Intelligence," the man said, offering his hand. "I wanted to thank you personally. Your innovation has saved a lot of lives." "Just did what needed doing, sir." It was more than that. Hendricks pulled out a folder, opened it to reveal a typed report. "I've been tracking implementation of your technique across 6 divisions. The numbers are remarkable. Before Holtzminden, average casualties for assault on fortified MG positions, 12 to 15 per engagement. After your technique spread, 3 to 4 per engagement. That's not just an improvement, Sergeant. That's revolutionary." Kowalski scanned the report. The statistics were impressive, even shocking. Across hundreds of engagements, the pattern held units using decoy tactics suffered dramatically fewer casualties than those using conventional assault methods. "So why isn't this in the manual?" Kowalski asked. Hendricks smiled sadly. "Because the manual is written by people who've never been shot at and approved by people who care more about institutional consistency than field results. Getting something into official doctrine takes years. Committees, testing, validation studies. By the time this makes it into FM 7 to 10, the war will probably be over." "Then what's the point of all this?" Kowalski gestured at the briefing room. "Patterson's guidelines, the acronym, the standardization. The point is that we're doing what we can within the system. These recommended techniques will filter down through training cadres and unit SOPs. In 6 months, every new lieutenant will have heard about Tejettin, even if they don't know where it came from. That's how real change happens in the Army. Not through official channels, but through unofficial networks. Unofficial networks built by guys like Patterson, who won't even call them scarecrows. Can you blame him? The man's trying to legitimize a farm trick as military tactics. He has to dress it up in language that makes staff officers comfortable. Otherwise, it gets dismissed as irregular and disappears into a filing cabinet. Kowalski handed back the folder. So the official story is coordinated ammunition exhaustion protocols, and the real story is a sergeant from Nebraska remembering how his dad scared crows. The official story, Hendricks corrected gently, is that American tactical innovation continues to give us an edge over German doctrinal rigidity. The real story is whatever helps you sleep at night. He paused. For what it's worth, I'm making sure your name stays in the intelligence summaries. 20 years from now, when some historian is writing about tactical evolution in the European theater, they'll find your name attached to this. Will they find the part about straw and old uniforms? Probably not, but they'll find the part about saving lives. That's what matters. Charlie Company Bivouac, Luxembourg border, December 1944. Winter came hard that year. By early December, the temperature had dropped below freezing, and the Third Army's advance had slowed to a crawl through mud and snow. Charlie Company was pulled back to a rest area near the Luxembourg border, a collection of abandoned farm buildings that offered minimal shelter from the weather, but at least put them out of artillery range. Kowalski spent his days supervising equipment, maintenance, and his nights trying to keep warm in a barn that had more gaps than walls. The war ground on. New replacements arrived to fill the slots left by casualties. The veterans taught the newcomers how to survive, where to dig foxholes, how to recognize incoming artillery by sound, which rations were edible and which were better used as fire starters. Nobody talked about Holzminden anymore. That was 2 months ago, ancient history in combat time. The company had fought a dozen engagements since then, taken 3 more objectives, lost 11 more men. The scarecrow trick had been used twice more with mixed results, once successfully, once not, but it was already fading into the background noise of 100 other tactical adaptations. On December 10th, Captain Morrison called Kowalski to the company CP. "Got something for you," Morrison said, handing over an official envelope. Came down from division. Kowalski opened it and found his Bronze Star citation typed on official letterhead, signed by a general whose name he didn't recognize. He read it once, then again, looking for any mention of scarecrows or dummies or the specific details of what had actually happened. There was nothing. Just the bureaucratic language Patterson had used. Exemplary tactical innovation, coordinated suppression techniques, significant reduction in friendly casualties. "Congratulations," Morrison said. "You earned it." "Did I? Feels like they're giving me credit for something they won't even admit happened." Morrison pulled out a bottle of French brandy, confiscated from somewhere, and poured 2 small glasses. "Welcome to the Army, Sergeant, where official reality and actual reality are 2 different things, and you're expected to pretend they're the same." He raised his glass. But the men who were there know what you did. That's worth more than any medal." They drank. The brandy was terrible, probably liberated from a collaborator's cellar, but it was warm. "I got a letter last week," Morrison continued, "from Lieutenant Harper. He's with division staff now, helping train replacements. Know what he's teaching them?" "Let me guess. Coordinated ammunition exhaustion protocols?" "Exactly, except he calls them scarecrows when the brass aren't listening. Says it's the most requested topic from new lieutenants. Everyone wants to know how to build them, how to deploy them, how to avoid getting their men killed taking machine gun nests." Morrison poured another round. "Your farm trick is saving lives across the entire theater, Kowalski, even if the manual won't admit it exists." Kowalski thought about that. Somewhere in France or Belgium or Germany, right now there was probably a sergeant building dummies out of whatever materials he could scrounge. Probably cursing the whole time, probably getting mocked by his squad, probably wondering if he was crazy. And then tomorrow, or the day after, those dummies would draw fire and men would live who otherwise would have died. "I heard 3rd Battalion lost their CO last week," Kowalski said. "Captain Webb, good officer." Stepped on a mine, instant. Morrison's face was grim. 80 men in that company, and they're down to 53. The math doesn't work, Kowalski. We're grinding through personnel faster than we can replace them. Every tactical improvement, every life-saving trick, it just slows the bleeding, doesn't stop it. So we keep finding tricks, keep adapting. Until when? Until we run out of tricks. Or until we run out of men to teach them to? Kowalski didn't have an answer for that. The question was too big, too existential. He was a sergeant, not a general. His world was the 100-yard radius around his squad, the immediate problem, the next firefight. Strategic questions were above his pay grade, but he understood what Morrison was really asking. Is innovation enough? Can individual cleverness compensate for institutional failure? Can sergeants keep saving their squads when the system keeps feeding them into the grinder? I don't know, sir, Kowalski admitted. I just know that doing nothing guarantees men die. Trying something, even something crazy, at least gives them a chance. Morrison nodded slowly. That's the only philosophy that matters in this war, the only one worth a damn. He raised his glass again. To trying something crazy. To trying something crazy. Winter quarters, late December 1944. The official recognition came in stages, each layer further removed from reality. Division published a tactical bulletin titled Field Expedient Methods for Position Assault. Kowalski's name appeared once in a footnote. The technique was described in technical language that made it sound like something developed in a laboratory, not improvised in desperation. Corpus Intelligence issued a summary of Lessons Learned Autumn Campaign. TTTTD received 3 paragraphs. No mention of straw, no mention of scarecrows, no mention of the 14 men who died before someone tried thinking differently. 3rd Army Headquarters sent out a training directive. All infantry companies were to receive instruction in diversionary target construction and deployment. The directive came with diagrams that looked nothing like the crude assemblies Kowalski had built. These were engineered mock-ups, precise and professional, probably designed by someone who'd never seen combat. And through it all, the real technique spread, not through official channels, but through the network of sergeants and corporals and squad leaders who actually did the fighting. They built their own versions, better, worse, different. They adapted the principle to local conditions. They taught it to replacements. They saved lives. By Christmas, Kowalski estimated that 200 engagements across the European theater had used some variant of the dummy tactic. The casualty reductions were measurable, significant, undeniable, and almost none of the official reports called them scarecrows. On Christmas Eve, Luca found Kowalski in the barn trying to read a letter from home by candlelight. Hey, Sarge, got something to show you. He held out a mimeographed sheet, a training manual excerpt, freshly printed. Look at this. Section on Advanced Suppression Techniques, page 4. Kowalski scanned the, document. There it was. A step-by-step guide to building tactical decoys for ammunition depletion purposes. The instructions were wrong in several places, too complicated, over-engineered, but the core principle was intact. They finally put it in writing, Lucas said. Took them 3 months, but they did it. They put something in writing, Kowalski corrected. Whether it's actually useful is another question. Does it matter? The idea's out there now. It's official. That means it's going to spread even faster. Maybe. Kowalski set the manual aside. Or maybe it means they've captured it, bureaucratized it, turned it into something rigid and inflexible. Something that looks like doctrine but doesn't work like improvisation. Gee, you're never happy, are you? Kowalski smiled faintly. I'm happy when men don't die. Everything else is just paperwork. Outside, snow was falling across the Luxembourg hills. Quiet, peaceful, beautiful in a way that made the war seem like a distant dream. Inside the barn, 32 men from Charlie Company celebrated Christmas with what they had. Canned rations, weak coffee, cigarettes, and the knowledge that they'd survived another month. Kowalski looked around at their faces. Some familiar from Normandy, some new replacements who'd arrived last week. Every one of them alive because of 100 small adaptations, 1,000 tactical improvisations, countless moments where someone had chosen to try something different instead of following doctrine into the grave. The scarecrows were just one trick among many. But important? Yes, life-saving, absolutely, but not unique. The real lesson wasn't about dummies or ammunition exhaustion. It was about the courage to question, to adapt, to remember that survival mattered more than conformity. You know what I think? Chen said, appearing with a bottle of something that might have been wine. I think 50 years from now they're going to teach Holtzminden at West Point. Some professor will lecture about tactical innovation in fluid combat environments, and cadets will take notes and write essays. And none of them will ever know it started with a farmer remembering how to scare crows. Good, Kowalski said. Let them think it was sophisticated. Let them think it was planned. As long as they learn that the best weapon isn't in the manual, it's in here. He tapped his temple. That's what keeps you alive, not doctrine. Thinking. They passed the bottle around, each man taking a small swallow. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the landscape in white, erasing the scars of combat for a few hours. Tomorrow the war would resume. Tomorrow men would die and objectives would be taken and the machine would grind on. But tonight, Charlie Company rested. And somewhere in their collective memory, straw men danced on ropes in the morning fog, fooling an enemy into exhaustion, proving that sometimes the simplest solutions were the deadliest. Kowalski Farm, Nebraska. Rifleman, 1946. The soil was black and rich, still damp from spring rains. William Kowalski stood at the edge of his father's cornfield, his cornfield now, and breathed in the smell of earth and growing things. No cordite, no blood, no death, just dirt and seed and the promise of harvest. Behind him, the farmhouse stood exactly as he'd left it in 1942. White paint peeling, porch sagging slightly, the roof still missing 3 shingles from a storm in 41. His father had died while Kowalski was in France. Heart attack, quick and clean. His mother had followed 3 months later. The farm had waited for him, silent and patient, maintained by neighbors who remembered when the Kowalskis had done the same for them. He'd been home for 2 weeks now. 2 weeks of silence and space and the profound strangeness of sleeping without fear. The nightmares came every 3rd or 4th night. Holtzminden, the MG42's buzzsaw rattle, D'Angelo dying in the wheat stubble, but they were fading. Slowly, like old photographs left in sunlight, the war was losing its color. Kowalski walked the fence line, checking posts and wire. This was the work now, fixing what had been neglected, preparing for planning, rebuilding a life that had been interrupted by 4 years of industrialized death. The Army had given him an honorable discharge, a Bronze Star, and a cheap frame and a train ticket home. Everything else was his to figure out. Near the northeast corner of the property, where the corn rows met the county road, stood the old scarecrow. His father had built it 20 years ago. Rough pine stakes for the frame, burlap sacks for the body. A battered hat that had belonged to Kowalski's grandfather. The wind moved it slightly, making it seem almost alive. Almost. Kowalski stopped and stared at it. In France, men had called him a genius for building something that looked exactly like this. They'd written citations and published training manuals and given him a medal for remembering what every farmer knew. That movement and silhouette were enough to fool a predator, that the appearance of threat was sometimes better than actual threat. He reached out and touched the scarecrow's burlap arm. The fabric was rotting, brittle with age and weather. Time to build a new one. Time to put new straw in old clothes and set it up to guard the crop. Time to do what his father had taught him, what he'd taught the Army, what would go on being useful long after the war became history. "Bill, that you out there?" Kowalski turned. His neighbor, Tom Hendricks, was walking up the road, waving. Tom's son had been in the Pacific, Marines, Okinawa. He'd come home with one leg and half his hearing. They'd talked once, briefly, about the war. Neither had much to say. Some experiences didn't fit into words. "Tom," Kowalski met him at the fence. "How's crops looking?" "Good. Got the wheat in 2 weeks ago. Should be a decent harvest if the weather holds." Tom glanced at the scarecrow. "Your dad's old sentinel. Still standing, I see." "Barely. Needs replacing. Don't we all?" Tom pulled out a pack of cigarettes, offered one to Kowalski, who declined. "Got a question for you, if you don't mind. Army stuff. Kowalski tensed slightly. What kind of question? My nephew's boy, Eddie, you remember him? He's going into the service next month, basic training at Fort Riley. He asked me if I knew anything about tactical stuff, combat advice. I told him I spent the last war loading ships in Brooklyn, didn't know a damn thing, but you... Tom gestured vaguely east, toward Europe, toward the past. You were over there, infantry. You saw combat. Some. What would you tell a kid going in? What's the most important thing to know? Kowalski thought about that. He thought about Holtzminden and the 14 dead and the scarecrows rising in the fog. He thought about doctrine and improvisation, about following orders and knowing when orders were wrong. He thought about a Nebraska farm trick saving 40 lives because someone had been willing to look stupid if it meant keeping men alive. Tell him, Kowalski said slowly, that the manual won't save him. The manual's written by people who aren't getting shot at. What'll save him is thinking, using what he knows, adapting to circumstances, not being afraid to try something different if the standard approach isn't working. Tom nodded, processing this. That's good advice. That from your training? No, that's from my dad. Kowalski gestured at the scarecrow. He taught me that the simplest solution is usually the right one. You don't need fancy equipment or complex plans. You just need to understand the problem and use what you've got. That's what wins fights. Your dad was a smart man, smarter than most generals I met. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two men who'd seen different versions of the same war, who understood without speaking that some parts of it would never make sense. Well, Tom said finally, I'll pass that along to Eddie. Common sense over doctrine. Think for yourself. He started to walk away, then paused. Hey, Bill. Glad you made it home. Not everyone did. No, not everyone. After Tom left, Kowalski returned to the scarecrow. He began dismantling it carefully, removing the rotted burlap, untying the wire that held the frame together. The wood was still good, old pine, weathered gray, but solid. He could reuse it. Waste not. As he worked, a truck rattled past on the county road heading toward town. The driver, Johnson, who ran the feed store, waved. Kowalski waved back. This was life now, trucks and neighbors and the slow rhythm of agricultural work. No drama, no glory, just the quiet accumulation of small tasks that built toward harvest. He carried the scarecrow frame back to the barn and set it against the wall. Tomorrow he'd find new burlap, fresh straw, maybe one of his old work shirts. He'd build it properly, the way his father had taught him, and then he'd set it up in the cornfield, and it would stand there all summer, keeping the crows away, doing its simple job without recognition or fanfare. Just like Holtzminden, Kowalski Farm, May 1946. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded from the Army's records office. Kowalski found it in the mailbox between a seed catalog and the county agricultural newsletter. Official envelope, War Department seal. He opened it standing in the driveway, half expecting a recall notice or some bureaucratic complication with his discharge papers. Instead, he found a short typed note from Lieutenant Colonel Hendricks, the intelligence officer who'd spoken to him after the briefing in November. Dear Sergeant Kowalski, I wanted to inform you that the technique you pioneered at Holtzminden has been officially incorporated into the Army's tactical training curriculum. The Field Manual 710 revision currently in draft includes a section on diversionary target deployment, based primarily on your innovation and subsequent field testing. Your name appears in the acknowledgments, though not in the main text. Standard practice for enlisted contributions to doctrinal development. I thought you should know that your work has been formally recognized, even if that recognition is largely invisible to anyone outside the tactical development community. Final casualty analysis for operations employing your technique. Estimated 400-600 lives saved across the European theater. October 1944, May 1945. That number is conservative and accounts only for documented deployments. Actual impact is likely significantly higher. I hope you found peace in civilian life. The Army is better for your service, whether it admits it or not. Respectfully, LTC James Hendricks Kowalski. Read the letter twice. 400 to 600 lives. That was more than Charlie Company's entire strength. That was a whole battalion of men who'd gone home because someone had remembered how scarecrows worked. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. Then he walked back toward the barn, where the new scarecrow was taking shape. Fresh burlap, clean straw, one of his father's old flannel shirts. He'd set it up tomorrow right at the edge of the cornfield where the crows liked to gather. The war was over. The men were home, or at least the ones who'd survived were home. The tactical manuals would be revised and the training would be updated. And somewhere in a file cabinet in Washington, there would be a record that Sergeant William Kowalski had contributed to FM 7210's development. And none of it mattered as much as the scarecrow he was building, County Fair, Nebraska. August 1946. The summer had been good. Enough rain, not too much heat. Corn growing tall and healthy. Kowalski walked through the county fair on a Saturday afternoon, surrounded by neighbors and farmers and families, enjoying the last weeks before harvest. There were pie contests and livestock shows and a tent where local veterans could gather and share stories. He avoided the veterans' tent. Instead, he found himself at the agricultural demonstration area where a county extension agent was teaching farmers about modern techniques, crop rotation, soil conservation, pest management. The agent, young, enthusiastic, probably never farmed a day in his life, was explaining the optimal spacing for scarecrows. The key, the agent said to a small crowd, is creating the illusion of presence. You want the birds to see movement, to perceive threat. Static scarecrows lose effectiveness after a few weeks, but if you can rig them to move with the wind, an older farmer interrupted. We've been doing that for 50 years, son. You're not telling us anything new. Of course, your traditional knowledge is valuable, but the Army actually studied this during the war, used similar principles for tactical deception. There's a whole section in their new manual about... Kowalski walked away. He didn't need to hear the rest. The Army had studied it. The Army had written it up. The Army had taken a farm trick and turned it into doctrine, removing all context, all humanity, all memory of the men who died before someone remembered to think like a farmer instead of a soldier. Near the livestock pens, he ran into a familiar face. Private First Class Luca, wearing civilian clothes but still carrying himself with that unmistakable military bearing. They recognized each other immediately. Sarge, Jesus, didn't know you were back in Nebraska. Been back since April. You got discharged in March, working at my uncle's garage in Omaha. Luca looked good. Healthy, whole, alive. You hear from any of the others? Chen, Morrison? Got a letter from Chen in June. He's in California using his GI Bill for engineering school. Nothing from Morrison. They talked for a while, carefully avoiding certain topics. Neither mentioned Holzminden directly, though it hung between them like smoke. Finally, Luca brought it up. You know they're teaching the scarecrow thing at Fort Benning now? My cousin's going through infantry training, and he wrote me about it, called it tactical target simulation or some shit. Said it was standard doctrine. I heard. Does it bother you that they took your idea and won't even credit it properly? Kowalski thought about the 400 to 600 lives, thought about the men who'd crossed fields without getting shot because someone had fooled a machine gunner into wasting ammunition, thought about all the soldiers who'd never know that a Nebraska farmer had saved them. No, he said finally, it doesn't bother me at all. Really, because it bothers me. You should be famous for that. They should have given you more than a Bronze Star. They should have kept my men alive, Kowalski interrupted quietly. That's all they should have done. Everything else is just noise. Luca was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. Yeah, I guess you're right. They parted ways after exchanging addresses, promising to stay in touch in the way that veterans always promised and rarely followed through on. Kowalski walked back toward his truck through the late afternoon sunshine, past the demonstration tents and the carnival rides and the 4-H exhibits. Near the exit, he passed a display about modern farming techniques. There was a scarecrow mounted on a pole, professionally constructed, perfectly balanced, designed to rotate in the wind. A sign beside it read, Advanced Pest Deterrence Using Movement and Silhouette. Kowalski smiled. Advanced Pest Deterrence, that's what they were calling it now. He climbed into his truck and drove home through the Nebraska evening, past fields turning gold with approaching harvest, past farmhouses where families gathered on porches to escape the heat. This was the world he'd fought for, not the abstract concept of freedom or democracy, but this specific landscape, these particular people, the quiet continuation of ordinary life. When he reached his farm, the scarecrow was right where he'd set it 3 months ago, standing guard over the corn. The crows had learned to avoid his field. The crop was healthy. The system worked. That night, Kowalski sat on his porch and watched the sun set over the cornfield. In the fading light, the scarecrow looked almost human, a solitary figure keeping watch while the world slept. He thought about all the other scarecrows standing in all the other fields across Nebraska, across America, each one a small deception that protected something valuable. He thought about Holtzminden, about dummies rising in the fog, about an MG-42 crew firing at ghosts until they had nothing left to fire. He thought about the official reports and the sanitized language and the way the Army had taken a desperate improvisation and turned it into something that looked like planning. And he thought about the 40 men from Charlie Company who'd lived, the 400 to 600 across the theater who'd survived, the thousands more in future wars who might survive because someone had written down that deception worked. That simplicity beat complexity, that thinking like a farmer could save soldiers' lives. None of them would ever know his name. The history books wouldn't record that Sergeant William Kowalski from Nebraska had pioneered tactical ammunition exhaustion through diversionary target deployment. The credit would go to the system, to the doctrine, to the faceless machinery of military innovation. But those men were alive. That was the only validation that mattered. Somewhere in Germany right now, there was probably a farmhouse with bullet holes in the walls, evidence of a machine gun position that had fired 2,000 rounds at straw and cloth. Someday someone might find those holes and wonder what kind of battle had happened there. They might imagine a fierce firefight, a desperate assault, heroism and sacrifice. They'd never know the truth that the real heroism was in refusing to waste lives, that the real sacrifice was looking foolish if it meant finding a better way. Kowalski finished his coffee and went inside. Tomorrow he'd start checking the corn, walking the rows, preparing for harvest. The work continued. The seasons turned. The scarecrows stood their silent watch, and 40 men he'd never see again were living their lives somewhere, raising families, building futures, never knowing that they existed because someone had remembered that the simplest solutions were often the right ones. That was enough. That was everything. The scarecrow in the cornfield turned slowly in the evening breeze, keeping watch over a crop that would feed people who'd never know it had been protected, just like the war, just like the lives saved by a farm trick that became doctrine. The Nebraska night settled in, quiet and vast, and William Kowalski slept without dreams of machine guns or dying men or innovations that wouldn't bear his name. He slept like a man who'd done his job and come home. Nothing more was needed. Nothing more ever would be.